Hello, this is John from kevolveprogramming.com, and in this tutorial we're going to look at using beans to store the data submitted in forms. So beans don't really apply to servlets because you can't use a JSP bean from a servlet as far as I know, but they are a very useful way of transferring data between JSP pages. And they can be a little difficult to integrate with the Model 2 model view controller architecture because you can't access them from your controller as far as I know. But nevertheless, we're going to look at it here because it's an important topic, and if you do a lot of web programming, you're definitely going to see this being used. So I've got a form here, and it's just got a single input type with the name user in it. It's a text control, and I'm going to add another control here. Let's have one called password as well, and I'm going to create a bean that can store a username and a password. So let's right click here, let's right click on a project actually, and go to new class, and I'm going to put this in a package called I'll call it user, and I'll put it in a package called beans. And it's very important to put your beans in packages because otherwise they tend not to work. And let's give this a private string user and a private string password, and I'll just right click here and I'll go to source and generate getters and setters, and let's generate getters and setters for these fields, and I'll just do Control Shift and then F in Eclipse to format the code a bit. And now in my form 1 I'm going to say here at the top here, JSP use bean. There we go, use bean. And I'll set the ID to user, and the class is going to be beans.user, capital U, and I'll set the scope to session, so this is available anywhere in this user's surfing session, hopefully. I actually let's take this out of here because in a future tutorial I actually am going to put this bean here in with the form, but I want to kind of build this up step by step. So I'm going to show you something just a little bit simpler in this tutorial, and I'm going to create another JSP here. So I'm going to say file, I'm going to right click and go to new JSP, and I'll call this form handler.jsp. Let's click finish, and in my form here I'm going to take this JSP here, I'm going to take this use bean statement and I'm going to paste it into this form handler.jsp, and while I'm at it I'm also going to right click here and create a new JSP, and I'm going to call it bean form.jsp, and I'm going to take my form from form1.jsp, and I'm just going to copy that. I'm going to put it into this bean form.jsp, because the reason I'm doing this is because I'm going to make this source code available to you. It's going to be you're going to be able to download the source code, and I don't want to actually confuse what I did before, which submits to the servlet, with the stuff I'm doing now. So let's just recap this. So I've got a beanform.jsp, and beanform.jsp has two text fields on it. It has a user and a password, and let's just put a line break between the two as well, like this. There we go. So it's got two text controls on it, and of course it's got a button, a submit button, and the action is post, and I'm going to submit the results of this to this form handler.jsp. Let's just run form handler.jsp so I can get the URL of it. And so if I copy the bit of the URL, excluding the domain name and starting with a slash here, go to beanform.jsp, and I'm just going to paste that in for the action. So my form now, my beanform.jsp, is going to submit its information to formhandler.jsp. And in formhandler.jsp, I'm going to say JSP use bean, and I'm going to use my my user bean that I created, my user bean class, and I'm also going to say JSP set property. And for set property, I'm just going to say property. This should be this could be the name of the parameter that you want to set. But as we saw in the previous tutorial, if I set this to star, it's actually going to look, or I think we saw this before. It's actually going to look for any. Oh yeah, I've got to give this a name as well. So let's say name equals user, because that's got to match the ID here. So the name has to match the ID of the bean. If I set property to star, it's going to look for any parameters that that match the get and set methods in this user bean. In other words, in this user class. So if I look at the user.java, we can see here that it's got a password property, and it's got a user property. So let's just run beanform.jsp. formhandler.jsp is saying user bean, use that class for this bean, and it's saying set property, and for property it says star. So if we've got a parameter that's called either user or password, because the user bean has those properties, user and password, my bean form is going to try to set those. My form handler.jsp is going to try to set those in the bean. And just to prove that, let's output the values that we set in the bean. So let's say here, I could use a JSP get property tag to get the values of it, but I quite like this way of doing it. We use an expression tag and we say user.get user there, and then let's have underneath that user.get password, and let's say here user name, and let's say here, if I can just get my mouse in the right place, let's say password. There we go. So let's just first look at this bit as a self-contained thing, and that's maybe easier. And if I'm going to run this, and I would expect, because my bean has properties user and password, if I supply parameters, whether by a post or a get in the URL, then they will be set in that bean, which will then be set into the session and hence available to other JSP pages. So I can say here question mark user equals John, and let's set the password as well. Let's say and password equals let me in. And if I run that, you can see now the bean has been set. The two properties on this bean have been set. So where are we? Formhandler.jsp. So in this bean we're setting this bit here is actually setting the user and a password from properties, and then we're echoing it back here. Now the great thing about this is that if you submit a form to this page, if you have this page as the action of a form, and if the form has a user and a password parameter here, of course it's going to end up setting the bean. So here we've got a user and a password parameter, and the submit action is formhandler.jsp with a method of post, or I could also use get, but post is better for forms. If I run this now, then let's type here, I'll say Sarah for the user, and for the password I'll say let me in again, and then let's click OK, and we can see now that it says username Sarah, password let me in. So the upshot of this is that you can make a form, you can have another JSP as a submit action of a form, and in the form that you're submitting to, formhandler.jsp in this case, you can use a bean to then collect the parameters and store them in the bean, and then that bean will be available to other JSP pages in your application, depending of course on what scope you set. So that's it for this tutorial, and this kind of breaks the model view controller architecture because we're not submitting to the controller, but we'll look at a special case of this next time where we're going to have the form submit to itself, and that's going to give us a kind of interesting way of validating the form contents and retaining the information in the form if the form can't be validated, if there's something wrong with it. And it's also just important to know this just because it's useful to know that you can do this, and as I say, if you see other examples of web application programming, you're probably going to come across this. So whether you decide to use it or not, and we will look at another way of doing this using a stricter Model 2 architecture, but it's nevertheless useful to know this. So that's it for this tutorial, and until next time, happy coding.